Ethan had built a wall around himself, a shield against the world. The scars of his past were too deep, and he refused to allow anyone to hurt him again. Love and trust had failed him, his family, his friends. They had betrayed him, and now he felt nothing. Emotion was a weakness, and weakness led to pain. So, he buried it all deep inside, never allowing himself to feel anything. His life was one of isolation, and that was just the way he liked it. No connections, no attachments. He lived in the cold emptiness he had created. A man who had long ago shut off his heart. Every day was the same for Ethan. There was no excitement, no joy. His life was a monotonous routine: wake up, work, sleep, repeat. Hope felt like something he could barely remember, a far-off idea he had long stopped believing in. Beneath the indifference, there was a simmering anger at the world for what it had done to him. But guilt always followed, reminding him of the heart he had locked away. Nothing ever changed. No risks, no surprises. It was easier to stay numb than to feel the pain of a broken heart. And then there was the dog, a small, scruffy thing, struggling to survive. It looked at Ethan with eyes that still believed in kindness, still clung to hope. For a moment, something stirred in Ethan, something deep and buried. The dog seemed to remind him of a time when he too had believed in goodness, in connection. But Ethan quickly dismissed the thought. He didn't need to care for a stray animal. He had enough of his own pain to deal with. Still, the dog's gaze lingered in his mind, a quiet pull he couldn't ignore. Ethan's heart was locked away, and that day, he did what came naturally. He tied the dog to a pole. He did it without a second thought, without hesitation. The dog needed him, but Ethan had nothing to give. He couldn't afford to care. He turned away, leaving the dog there, helpless and abandoned. Its eyes followed him, but Ethan didn't look back. He didn't feel the guilt or the pain. To him, it was just another thing he could shut out. The dog was just another reminder of the emotions he had buried long ago. The dog had been tied to the pole for hours now, its once lively eyes now clouded with exhaustion. Each breath seemed to take more effort than the last. Its ribs protruded painfully, a clear sign of hunger and thirst, the signs of neglect eating away at its small frame. Its dry tongue licked at the air in search of relief, but none came. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the dog's whimpers grew more desperate. Its tiny body trembled, a quiet plea for someone, anyone, to come to its aid. But the street was empty, the world oblivious to the suffering of the innocent creature. Every time the dog's eyes fluttered closed, it seemed to find a brief, painful rest before waking again, its gaze searching, pleading, as if it still believed there was hope, that someone would come. Despite its condition, there was a flicker of something in the dog's heart, a flicker of hope. Even in its weakness, it didn't give up, waiting for the person who could save it. It didn't understand the world, but it understood the warmth of kindness, and that was all it wanted now, someone to care. Ethan's past had broken him piece by piece. He had been a young man full of dreams once, but those dreams had been shattered, first by the death of his mother, then by the betrayal of a friend he trusted more than family. Each blow had chipped away at his heart, until there was nothing left but a shell. It wasn't that he didn't feel, it was that he couldn't allow himself to feel anymore. The pain was too much, too overwhelming, and he had learned long ago that feeling meant suffering. Over time, he built walls around himself, each brick a defense against the world that had hurt him. He kept his distance from everyone. Family, friends, none of them had ever been able to understand. So why bother trying? He had learned to live in his numbness, and it had kept him safe. But it also left him hollow. He couldn't connect with anyone or anything, not even the dog that now lingered in his peripheral vision. The dog's whimpers echoed in his ears, but all he felt was indifference. He wasn't capable of compassion. He had locked away his heart so tightly that even the most desperate cries for help couldn't reach him. The dog's whimpers seemed to pierce through Ethan's cold indifference. He had tried to ignore it, tried to drown it out with the noise of his own thoughts. But it was no use. The cries were growing louder, sharper, and no matter how hard he tried to push them away, a seed of guilt began to take root. It had been hours since he tied the dog to that pole. Hours since he had walked away, unable to give a single thought to the suffering he had left behind. But now, as the cries grew more desperate, something inside him stirred. Something he hadn't felt in years. He hated it. Hated the softness, the weakness that the guilt brought with it. His mind raced. He didn't want to care. He couldn't afford to care. The world had taken enough from him. Yet here he was, standing frozen, unable to escape the weight of his own indifference. Every cry from the dog seemed to weigh him down further. He knew what he had done was cruel, but how could he change now? His heart was a fortress, and he had no idea how to break through it. As the hours passed, something inside Ethan began to shift. He stood there, just a few feet away from the dog, but it felt like miles. A brief memory flashed across his mind. A time when he had shown kindness, a time when he had been loved. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough to stir something, a flicker of empathy. The dog's sad eyes seemed to look right into him, and for a moment he almost felt that pull, like a part of him wanted to help. But he quickly pushed it away. He couldn't allow himself to feel. It was too dangerous, too risky. If he cared now, he'd only open the door to more pain. But still, the feeling lingered, refusing to fade. The memory of the warmth he had once known seemed to whisper in his ears, and the dog's pitiful stare made it impossible to ignore any longer. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, and then another, as if pulled by an invisible force. His heart was still guarded, still terrified of what could happen if he let it open even a crack. But something about the dog's silent plea, its unwavering hope, made him pause. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt torn, caught between his old, numb self and the possibility of something better, something more compassionate. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Ethan stood there, his hands buried deep in his pockets, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He didn't look up, didn't care. But the stranger, a man with a weathered face and soft eyes, came to a stop next to him, his gaze fixed on the dog. "Is this your dog?" the stranger asked, his voice calm but firm. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted to the dog, its body trembling against the pole, its hunger and thirst apparent. He shrugged, offering a brief, dismissive answer. "It's not my problem." The man didn't back down. "You tied it there," he said, pointing to the rope that bound the dog. "How can you just leave it like this?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "It's just a dog. Why should I care?" The stranger's eyes narrowed, and there was a moment of silence. Then he took a step closer, his voice softer but no less pointed. "It's not just a dog. It's a living being. It's suffering. And you," he paused, his words hitting harder. "You're letting it suffer." Ethan's chest tightened. His first instinct was to lash out, to defend his indifference. But something in the stranger's gaze held him back. He looked away, gripping his sleeves. "I didn't do anything," he muttered, trying to push the words down. But the stranger wasn't finished. "You didn't do anything. That's the problem." His voice grew more urgent. "You have the power to help, and you're choosing not to. Don't you feel anything at all?" Ethan flinched, the words echoing in his mind. Despite himself, the man's challenge sank deep into him. The seed of doubt was planted, and as much as he tried to resist, he couldn't shake it. What kind of person was he, really? The stranger's words lingered in Ethan's mind, gnawing at him like a persistent itch. He walked away from the scene, but his steps felt heavy. The dog's cries seemed to follow him, haunting every corner of his thoughts. There was a growing tension inside him, a conflict he couldn't ignore. He found himself glancing back toward the dog, its pitiful whimpers cutting through the stillness. A part of him wanted to run to it, to untie it, to do something, anything to end its suffering. But another part, the part that had been built over years of pain and betrayal, recoiled. His past was a fortress, and he had spent years building its walls. Every betrayal, every heartbreak had reinforced his armor. He couldn't risk letting those walls crumble now. Not for a dog, not for anything. But as much as he tried to shut out the feeling, a flicker of compassion pushed through. It wasn't strong, just a brief spark of something warm and unfamiliar. He felt the pull to help, but it was buried under layers of fear. Fear of being vulnerable, fear of being hurt. He clenched his fists, breathing deeply, as if trying to rid himself of the emotional storm brewing inside. He had to stay detached. He had to stay cold. But the more he fought it, the harder it became to ignore the pull toward compassion. It was like a battle within him, his instinct to protect himself versus the growing sense of duty to the suffering creature. As Ethan stood there, caught between two conflicting forces, he could hear the dog's cries grow weaker. The once strong, desperate wails had turned into faint whimpers, almost as if the dog was losing the strength to fight. The sight of the dog's frail body, its ribs stark against its skin, made Ethan's stomach churn. It was getting worse. The dog's suffering was becoming unbearable, and with each passing minute, it seemed to grow more frail, its cries softer, less hopeful. Ethan's mind raced. His legs itched to move toward the dog, but his heart anchored him in place. He couldn't act, couldn't show weakness. If he did, it would only open a floodgate of emotions he wasn't ready to face. But the urgency was undeniable. The dog's condition was deteriorating right in front of him, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt helpless. His indifference had only made the situation worse. The guilt began to build, a weight he couldn't ignore. He had the power to fix this. All he had to do was act. The dog's silent plea pierced his heart. Its eyes locked onto his with an innocence that seemed to demand compassion. Ethan could no longer escape it. He could feel the pressure mounting, the responsibility of the moment pressing against him like an invisible force. The dog's suffering was no longer just a reflection of its pain. It was a mirror of his own. The weight of the dog's cries, the fragility of its body, made Ethan face a truth he couldn't deny. If he didn't act soon, it might be too late for the dog. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of the moment heavy on his chest. He thought back to his own past, his pain, his brokenness. His choices had led him here, to this exact moment, facing a life-or-death decision for a creature he barely knew. The guilt from years of emotional detachment flooded him, making it even harder to breathe. He had closed himself off for so long, convinced that feeling anything would only hurt him more. But now, standing here, he could feel the full force of his own choices, the consequences of a life spent running from his emotions. The dog's suffering wasn't just a call for help. It was a reflection of his own pain, a mirror he couldn't avoid. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He felt something shift inside him, a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to change. A way to break free from the numbness that had held him captive for so long. The possibility of redemption felt within reach, but doubt lingered like a shadow. What if he failed? What if he couldn't make things right? What if he tried only to end up hurting more than before? The fear gnawed at him, and for a moment, he thought about walking away, leaving the dog behind like he had always done with his emotions. But deep down, he knew that walking away would be a failure, not just for the dog, but for himself. The fear of failure weighed heavily on him, but so did the fear of staying the same. Ethan was at a crossroads, unsure whether he was capable of change, but knowing that if he didn't try, he would remain locked in the same cage of indifference he had built for so many years. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the dog. Its body was slumped against the pole, barely moving, its breath shallow and labored. The faint whimpers that escaped its mouth were a stark reminder of just how badly it was suffering. The once vibrant dog was now a shell of itself, its eyes dull, its energy spent. Ethan's stomach turned as he realized the severity of the situation. The dog wasn't just tired, it was dying. Each shallow breath it took seemed to be its last, and every second that ticked by pushed it closer to the edge. His heart raced, panic creeping in. This wasn't just a matter of inconvenience or indifference anymore. The dog's life was slipping away with every breath, and Ethan knew he was responsible for it. His hand hovered in the air, trembling, as if he could make the decision without committing to it. But deep down, he knew there was no avoiding it. He had to act. But the weight of the decision pressed down on him, and for a moment he just stood there, unable to move. Every second felt like a crushing eternity. The ticking of the clock was deafening. The dog's cries grew weaker, and with them, so did Ethan's resolve. If he didn't do something now, it would be too late. He had no choice. It was now or never. Ethan's mind wasn't just focused on the dog. As he stood there, paralyzed by indecision, flashes of his past began to resurface. Painful memories he had buried long ago. He saw his mother's face, red with anger as she turned away from him, rejecting his outstretched hand. The memory of betrayal by his closest friend echoed in his mind, the way they had walked away when he needed them most. Each image brought a fresh wave of hurt, each one reinforcing the walls he had built around his heart. The dog's suffering felt like a mirror of his own loneliness, a reflection of the pain he had buried deep within himself for years. His mind screamed at him to shut it out, to turn away from the dog before it hurt him too. After all, allowing himself to care meant opening the door to more pain. Didn't it? He felt trapped in a cycle of fear. Every time he had opened up in the past, he had been let down. Every time he had let someone in, they had left. He wondered if he was capable of breaking free from this cycle, or if it was just too dangerous. His pulse quickened, the battle between his heart and his fear raging within him. Could he risk caring again? Could he risk vulnerability? The internal battle raged in Ethan's chest, but something inside him shifted. The dog's suffering was no longer just a mirror to his own. It was something real, something urgent that couldn't be ignored. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the rope that bound the dog. His heart pounded in his chest as he gently untied it, the weight of the decision still heavy but no longer paralyzing. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something: empathy, tenderness, care. He knelt beside the dog, his hands shaking as he lifted it slightly to offer it a sip of water. The dog's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, Ethan saw a flicker of recognition. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The dog was still fighting to survive, and that small spark of life ignited something in Ethan that he thought he had lost. As he tended to the dog's wounds, a mix of relief and fear washed over him. He was doing it. He was acting with compassion, something he hadn't done in so long. The weight of change felt heavy on his shoulders, but it also felt freeing. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he could change, that he was capable of it. And with that small act of kindness, a larger transformation had begun, not just for the dog, but for himself. He was taking the first step toward redemption, a step he never thought he'd take. Ethan's hands trembled as he watched the dog, now resting peacefully on the floor, its breathing steady. But despite the relief, a knot tightened in his chest. The dog was safe, yes, but was it enough? Had he waited too long? The image of the dog's frail, broken body flashed in his mind, a constant reminder of the suffering he had allowed to go on for far too long. Ethan felt a pang of guilt that he couldn't shake. He had acted when it was almost too late, and now he wondered if it had made any difference at all. What if he had done something sooner? What if the dog could have been saved earlier, before it came to this moment of desperation? Confusion clouded his thoughts. He had taken action, he had made the choice to change, but he wasn't sure what to do with that change. The moment of kindness, the act of saving the dog, had brought a shift in him, but what now? He wasn't ready to face all of the emotions stirring inside him. It felt like opening a door that had been closed for so long. What if letting those feelings out meant he couldn't control them? Slowly, Ethan noticed small changes in himself. He found himself listening to others more, allowing himself to feel something, empathy, even, but the feelings were fleeting, like a shadow that disappeared when he tried to reach for it. The internal conflict gnawed at him. He wanted to be proud of his actions, but he also feared that this was just a small step in a long, complicated journey. Had he truly changed? Or was he only scratching the surface of something much deeper? The first time Ethan tried to connect with someone after the rescue, he almost couldn't do it. He stood in front of a colleague at work, his mouth dry, unsure of what to say. The words seemed to stick in his throat. How could he talk about something so personal, something that had completely shifted his world? But then, without thinking, he offered a smile. A simple, "How's your day going?" It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few days, small acts of connection began to feel more natural. He found himself holding the door for strangers, offering a kind word to a friend, or simply pausing to listen to someone's story. Each moment felt uncomfortable at first, but it also brought a sense of warmth that he had been missing for so long. Ethan had always thought vulnerability was a weakness, something to be avoided at all costs. But as he started to open up to others, he realized something surprising. It wasn't weakness. It was strength. Strength to face his fears, to show up and connect with the people around him. There was a quiet courage in allowing himself to be seen, even if it meant facing his own brokenness. The more he embraced it, the more he understood that healing wasn't just about fixing himself. It was about building bridges to others, sharing the journey together. Ethan's walls, built over years of pain, were slowly starting to crumble. With each conversation, each moment of vulnerability, he felt stronger, ready to face whatever lay ahead. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in his healing. The dog, once weak and broken, had become more than just a rescued animal. It had become a symbol. To Ethan, the dog's recovery was a reminder of his own journey. Both of them had been neglected, hurt, and alone. But just as the dog was slowly mending, so was he. The dog's survival was proof that change, healing, and redemption were possible. Every time he saw the dog, now wagging its tail with joy and energy, Ethan saw hope. It wasn't just a reflection of what he had done for the dog. It was a reflection of what he could still do for himself. He too could heal. He too could learn to trust again. The dog's progress had taught him the power of compassion. the transformative power of caring for something other than himself. Every moment of the dog's recovery felt like a victory for both of them. The dog was no longer just a victim of circumstance. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of love and kindness. And as it healed, so did Ethan. The journey was long, and there would be more challenges ahead, but the dog had shown him the way. He was no longer lost in his pain. He was beginning to find his path. As Ethan looked back on the days following the rescue, he realized how much he had learned. He had discovered that healing wasn't a one-time thing. It was a journey, one that required compassion, forgiveness, and a willingness to love again. He had spent so long holding on to guilt, blaming himself for past mistakes. But with each passing day, he began to understand that holding on to that pain wasn't helping anyone. Not him, and certainly not the dog. The key to healing had always been forgiveness. Forgiving others, yes, but also forgiving himself. It was hard to let go of the shame he had carried for so long, but the more he did, the lighter he felt. He could see now that his flaws didn't define him. They were just parts of his story, parts of the journey that had led him here. True healing didn't come from perfection. It came from accepting his flaws, acknowledging his mistakes, and finding the courage to keep moving forward. It came from allowing himself to be vulnerable, to feel love and pain without fear. Ethan was only beginning to understand that, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. With each step forward, he was embracing the possibility of a new beginning, one filled with compassion, forgiveness, and the courage to love. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey of healing and hope. Your support means the world, and we'd love for you to be part of this community. Together, we can make a difference. Subscribe now and stay inspired.